The end of her world came not with a bang, but with the dry rustle of a treaty parchment and the scent of sealing wax. Ilara stood on the balcony of her father's crumbling keep, the stone cold beneath her slippers even through the thin wool. Below, the last of the autumn roses were shedding their petals, a slow, blood-colored surrender to the coming frost. It felt like a mirror to her own heart. 6 days now, she had known. 6 days since the envoys from the Court of Quiet Sorrows had arrived, their silver-grey banners a stark slash against the tired gold and crimson of her own kingdom. They had not come for war. They had come for peace, a peace to be purchased with a single, barren bride. Ha! The air was thin and sharp, carrying the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. A familiar scent, the smell of home, yet it offered no comfort tonight. It only sharpened the edges of her grief. She was the last of a line that had stretched back 1,000 years, a lineage famed for its vibrant life, its boisterous halls, its broods of bright-eyed children. And it would end with her. The whispers had followed her for years, ever since her marriage to a kind, hopeful prince who had died of a fever before their 2nd anniversary, leaving her a widow at 19 and, worse, childless. The court physicians had clucked their tongues, brewed their bitter herbs, and finally declared it a failing in her own constitution. A garden where no seed would sprout. Now, at 25, she was a political tool, a baron offering to a king who had no need for heirs of the blood. A hand, light and wrinkled as a dried leaf, settled on her arm. "My lady," murmured Anya, her nurse since birth, her face a roadmap of worry in the fading twilight. "You will catch a chill." Ilara did not turn. "It does not matter, Anya. The chill is already inside." Her voice was a thread, easily broken. "They say his castle is carved from the heart of a frozen mountain. That the sun never touches its highest spires. They say many things," Anya said, her tone attempting a sturdiness it did not possess. "They are tales to frighten children. And what am I?" Ilara whispered to the dying roses, "if not a child who has failed at the one thing she was born to do?" She could feel Anya's unspoken protest, the lifetime of love and fierce protection welling up in the old woman's throat. But there were no words for this. The treaty was signed. Her dowry was not in lands or gold, but in the cessation of a century of border skirmishes. Her life for the quiet lives of thousands. It was, her father had said, his voice heavy with a regret that felt both genuine and useless, a noble sacrifice. To Ilara, it felt like an erasure. She would go to this vampire king, this ancient, deathless creature of the night, and she would fade into the shadows of his court, a ghost before she was even dead. The journey north was a study in subtraction. The rolling green hills of her homeland flattened into stark, grey plains. The boisterous inns gave way to silent, watchful hamlets huddled against the wind. The sky, once a brilliant, aching blue, seemed to pale, thinning to a wash of silver. With each league, Ilara felt another piece of herself being stripped away. The warmth, the noise, the easy, sunlit life she had known was a memory that grew more distant with every turn of the carriage wheels. Her guards, brave men who had known her since she was a girl, grew quieter, their hands straying more often to the hilts of their swords. They were riding into legend, and they felt the weight of it. Caitian's kingdom, when they finally reached it, was not made of ice. It was carved from black basalt that drank the light, a fortress of jagged spires that clawed at the perpetually overcast sky. A river the color of slate coiled around its base, silent and swift. There was no sound, no birds, no wind in the trees, for there were no trees, only stone and sky and a profound, unnerving stillness. The gates, wrought in a filigree of what looked like sleeping thorns, swung open without a sound, moved by an unseen force. As she stepped from the carriage, the air itself felt different. It was cold, yes, but it was a deep, ancient cold, the cold of a crypt, of a place untouched by the frantic, fleeting heat of mortal life. A figure waited for her at the top of the grand stairs. He was tall, impossibly so, and clad in shades of night charcoal and deep violet. His hair was the color of polished silver, a stark contrast to the youth of his face. He was beautiful, she noted with a distant, clinical part of her mind. Not a monster of fang and claw, but a creature of terrible, perfect symmetry. His eyes, when they met hers, were the color of twilight, a deep, bruised purple that held no reflection, only an unnerving depth. This was the Vampire King. He did not move as she ascended the steps, her heart a frantic drum against the cage of her ribs. He simply watched, his stillness a force more intimidating than any overt threat. Lady Alara of House Valerus, his voice was low, resonant, like the tolling of a distant bell. It did not echo in the vast courtyard, it seemed to be absorbed by the stone itself. "Welcome to Nocturne." She curtsied, her movements stiff with a fear she refused to show. "Your Majesty," the words were barely a breath. He inclined his head, a minute, graceful movement. "I am Cation. Your journey was long. You will be shown to your chambers. Rest." It was a dismissal. He turned, his cloak swirling around him like smoke, and disappeared into the shadowed archway behind him. He had not smiled. He had not offered a hand. He had looked at her not as a bride, not even as a queen, but as a piece of a political puzzle that had just been slotted into place. The cold she had felt on the balcony back home was nothing compared to the profound, absolute chill that settled into her bones now. She was a world away from everything she had ever known, a flicker of mortal warmth in a kingdom of eternal, silent winter. And she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her sacrifice had just begun. The chambers assigned to her were opulent, a suite of rooms larger than her entire family's wing back home. The walls were hung with tapestries woven from silver and black thread, depicting constellations she did not recognize. The furniture was carved from a pale, petrified wood that seemed to glow with a faint internal luminescence. A fire crackled in the hearth, but its flames cast a cool, blue light and gave off no discernible heat. It was all beautiful, and all of it felt profoundly wrong. It was the artistry of the grave, a perfect, lifeless beauty that offered no comfort. For 3 weeks, she lived in this gilded cage. She saw Cation only twice, both times at the silent, formal dinners held in the grand hall. He sat at the head of a table that could have seated 100, though only a dozen of his courtiers were ever present. They were like him, impossibly beautiful, impossibly still. They moved with a liquid grace that was unnerving, their conversations murmured in a language she did not understand, their twilight eyes occasionally flicking towards her, the sole splash of color and clumsy mortality in their monochrome world. They did not eat the food served to her, delicate pastries, roasted fowl, fruits that tasted of ash. They drank from dark, crystal goblets, a liquid the color of deep rubies. She tried not to think about what it was. Cation never addressed her directly at these meals. He would incline his head in greeting, and again in dismissal. The rest of the time, he seemed to forget she was there. And yet, she felt his gaze on her constantly. It was not a leering or possessive look, but something far more unsettling. It was analytical. He watched her the way a scholar might watch a strange, new specimen, with a detached, ancient curiosity. He watched the way her hand trembled when she lifted her fork, the way her breath misted in the cold air, the way the pulse beat a frantic rhythm at the base of her throat. He was studying the mechanics of her life, and it made her feel like a machine about to break down. Her days were spent in suffocating solitude. She explored the castle, a labyrinth of silent corridors, vast libraries filled with books whose pages were brittle as autumn leaves, and forgotten ballrooms where dust motes danced in the thin shafts of grey light that pierced the high, arched windows. The entire castle felt like it was holding its breath. It was a place of memory, not of living. One afternoon, desperate for a sliver of the life she'd lost, she found a conservatory. It was a vast dome of smoked glass, and inside, instead of the vibrant, sun-loving flowers of her home, grew a garden of the night. Pale, moon-white blossoms, silver-leafed ferns, and vines that bore clusters of black, jewel-like berries. It was beautiful, in its own somber way, but it was a beauty that spoke of shadow and silence. She sank onto a stone bench, the cold of it seeping through her velvet gown, and for the first time since she had arrived, she allowed the tears to fall. They were not loud, racking sobs, but a silent, desperate weeping for everything she had lost. For the warmth of the sun on her face, for the raucous laughter of her father's court, for the plump, dimpled hands of the children she would never hold. Her line, her name, her future, it was all dust. She was a barren queen for a deathless king in a lifeless kingdom. The treaty had saved her people, but it had hollowed her out, leaving nothing behind but this aching, cavernous emptiness. Tears are a uniquely mortal expression. The voice came from behind her, Caitian's low resonance. She gasped, spinning around, her hands flying to her wet cheeks. He stood in the archway, a silhouette against the dim light of the corridor. He moved with no sound. Your Majesty. I apologize, she stammered, trying to rise, to compose herself into the proper image of a queen. For what? He asked, taking a step into the conservatory. The faint, blue light from the firestones caught the silver of his hair. For grieving. She said nothing, merely lowered her head, her wet lashes clinging to her cheeks. She waited for the dismissal, the cold command to return to her rooms. Instead, he walked slowly toward a cluster of night-blooming jasmine, its white, star-shaped flowers perfuming the air with a scent that was both sweet and funereal. He trailed a long, elegant finger over one of the petals. These flowers store the memory of sunlight. They hoard it all day, deep in their roots, and release it only in the darkness, as light and fragrance. A strange sort of life, is it not? Ilara watched him, her fear warring with a flicker of confusion. This was the most he had spoken to her since her arrival. His voice was not cold, merely contemplative. The words tumbled out of her before she could stop them, a raw, ragged confession born of weeks of solitude and despair. I know nothing of such life. The only life I was meant to foster was the one I cannot create. I was meant to be a mother. I was meant to fill the halls with the sounds of children. Her voice broke on the last word, and she pressed her lips together, furious at her own weakness. I can't have enough children. I can't even have 1 inch. The silence that followed was vast. She expected pity, or worse, indifference. She expected him to see her as her own people had, a beautiful, tragic failure. She braced herself for the confirmation of her own worthlessness. Caitian turned from the flowers, his twilight eyes fixing on hers. A slow, strange expression softened the sharp, statuesque lines of his face. It was not a smirk, or a sneer. It was a smile, but one of such profound, ancient gentleness that it took her breath away. It was a smile that held centuries of sorrow and a sliver of something that looked like wonder. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming in the quiet space. You have enough life within you already. The words hung in the air between them, simple and yet incomprehensible. She stared at him, her tear-streaked face a mask of confusion. He spoke of life as if it were a quality, a substance she possessed, not an act she was required to perform. He saw something in her, something she had never thought to look for in herself. In the heart of his dead kingdom, surrounded by the ghosts of his court and the scent of night-blooming flowers, the vampire king had looked at her, the barren queen, and spoken not of her failure, but of her abundance. And for the first time in a very long time, Ilara did not know what to think. The foundation of her grief, the certainty of her own emptiness, had been shaken by a single, quiet sentence. The king's words followed her like a second shadow in the days that followed. You have enough life within you already. She turned them over and over in her mind, searching for their meaning, for a hidden barb or a courtly platitude. But his tone had held neither. It had been a statement of fact, as simple and irrefutable as a declaration that the sky was grey. It unsettled her more than any threat could have. Her entire identity had been built upon a sense of lack, a hollow space at her center where children should have been. To be told she was already full felt like a riddle she couldn't solve. She began to watch him more closely during their silent dinners. He was still a creature of immense and unnerving stillness, but she started to notice the minute details. The way his long fingers would rest on the stem of his goblet, not holding it so much as communing with the crystal. The way his eyes, those deep pools of twilight, would track the slow dance of a spider spinning a web in the high rafters, his focus as absolute as if he were reading a sacred text. He was an observer of small, quiet lives. He seemed to find significance in things she had never thought to look at twice. One evening, emboldened by a strange, new curiosity, she did not immediately retreat to her chambers after the meal was concluded. As the other courtiers melted back into the castle's shadows, she remained in her seat. Caitian, who had risen to leave, paused at the head of the table, his gaze falling upon her. Is something amiss, my lady? He asked. His voice, as always, did not echo. She clasped her hands in her lap to still their trembling. I do not understand what you meant. In the conservatory. He was silent for a long moment, studying her face. He did not seem annoyed by the question, but rather, intrigued. He gestured to the chair beside him. Walk with me. It was not a request. Elara rose and followed him from the great hall, her soft slippers a whisper against the stone, a stark contrast to his utter silence. He led her not toward her own wing, but deeper into the castle, down corridors she had not yet dared to explore. The sconces on the walls held not candles, but globes of cool, blue witchlight that cast long, distorted shadows. They walked through a gallery where the portraits were not of people, but of landscapes under stormy skies, of crashing waves and splintered trees. It was a gallery dedicated to the fierce, untamable power of the world. Finally, he stopped before a pair of heavy, iron-bound doors. He pushed them open, and they swung inward without a creak. He had brought her to the castle library. It was a space that defied reason, a vast, circular chamber that seemed to stretch up into the very heart of the highest tower. Bookshelves spiraled up the walls, disappearing into the gloom far above. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and dust, the scent of accumulated time. A single, massive desk sat in the center of the room, its surface clear save for one open book. You believe life is a matter of propagation, Cation stated, his voice softer in the book-lined silence. A flame passed from one candle to the next, and if the flame is not passed, it is a failure. It is the way of my people, she replied, her own voice a hush. A line must continue. A legacy must be secured. A legacy, he mused, walking toward the central desk. He ran a hand over the open book. It was an atlas of the stars, the constellations rendered in delicate silver ink. I have watched your house Valerus for 900 of its 1,000 years. I watched its founder lay the first stone of your keep. I have seen your ancestors love, and fight, and build, and die. I have seen their children, and their children's children. A river of blood and breath, flowing through time. He looked up at her, his eyes holding the weight of all those centuries. And I have seen it dry to a trickle. Is that the only measure of your worth? The biological continuation of a name? The question was so direct, so dismissive of everything she had been taught to revere, that it left her speechless. What you call life, he continued, turning a page in the star atlas, is a frantic, fleeting thing. A moth's dance around a flame. It burns brightly and is gone. I have seen empires rise from dust and return to it in the span of one of my lifetimes. What endures is not the blood. It is the story. The art. The question asked of the universe. He tapped the silver-inked stars. This chart was drawn by a man who died 5,000 years ago. He had no children. Is his life a failure? Elara stared at the intricate map of the heavens. No, but he created something. And you do not. Cation countered, his gaze sharp. When you weep in the conservatory, is that not a creation? It is a visceral response to loss, a testament to the love you hold for a future you cannot have. It is a feeling so powerful it transforms into salt and water. Is the grief of a barren queen less profound than the joy of a mother? Your sorrow has a shape, a weight, a texture. It is a real thing in the world. That is a form of life, Lady Elara. She felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the floor of the library had tilted beneath her feet. He was dissecting her very soul, laying it bare, but not with a physician's cold detachment. He was examining it as if it were a work of art, finding meaning in its broken places. When you stand on your balcony and watch the last rose of autumn fall, he went on, his voice a mesmerizing cadence, you are not merely seeing a dying flower. You are feeling the echo of your own mortality, the beauty of a final, defiant act of color before the coming of the cold. Your heart breaks a little, does it not? She could only nod, her throat tight. That heartbreak is life, he said simply. The capacity to feel that, to see the universe reflected in a single falling petal, is a vibrancy that many who are busy creating heirs and legacies never have time to cultivate. They are so focused on the next generation that they do not truly inhabit their own lives. They do not see. He finally looked away from the book and directly at her. I have watched you for 3 weeks. I have seen you trace the patterns of frost on your window pane. I have seen you listen to the silence of this castle as if it were a song. I have seen you mourn a world you have lost with a purity that is, in itself, a form of creation. You are not empty, Elara. You are so full of life it aches. He had used her name. Not my lady, not Lady Elara, but Elara. The sound of it in his ancient, resonant voice was both intimate and terrifying. He saw her. Not the barren bride, not the political pawn, not the last of a dying line. He saw the sorrow, the quiet observation, the deep, untapped well of feeling within her, and he called it life. She thought of her father, of the court physicians, of the pitying glances of the ladies-in-waiting. They had all looked at her and seen a vessel that could not be filled. An absence. Cation looked at her and saw an abundance. It was a terrifying, exhilarating, world-altering thought. What are you? She whispered, the question not about his nature as a vampire, but about his ability to see into the deepest, most hidden corners of her heart. He gave her that same, slow, gentle smile she had seen in the conservatory. I am a king of a quiet court. I have had 10,000 years to learn how to listen to the things that do not speak. He closed the star atlas, the sound of the heavy cover falling shut echoing the finality of his statement. He had given her an answer, and in doing so, had dismantled the very architecture of her despair. She was not a failure. She was something else. Something full of a strange, quiet, aching life that only he, the deathless king, had ever thought to notice. The library felt less like a tomb of old knowledge and more like a sanctuary, and for the first time, the profound silence of the castle did not feel empty. It felt expectant. The conversation in the library became a crack in the dam of her solitude. Cation began to seek her out, not for state dinners, but for quiet hours spent in the far-flung corners of his domain. He showed her an orrery in a high tower, a magnificent creation of silver and brass where celestial bodies drifted on silent, intricate clockwork. He explained the long, slow dance of dead stars and nascent galaxies, his voice weaving a tapestry of cosmic time that made her own brief, mortal lifespan feel both impossibly small and exquisitely precious. He would find her in the Gallery of Storms and speak of the artists, mortals he had known centuries ago, who had spent their lives trying to capture the soul of a thunderclap on canvas. This one, he said one afternoon, indicating a painting of a single, lightning-blasted oak, was a woman named Lyra. She was a farmer. She lost her entire family to a plague. Afterward, she never spoke another word. She only painted. She poured all of her grief into the sky. Elara looked at the violent, beautiful image, at the raw power captured in the oils, and she understood. Lyra had not created a child, a continuation of her bloodline. She had created this. A testament to her pain that had outlived her by 700 years. It was another kind of legacy. Their time together began to form a quiet rhythm, a counterpoint to the unchanging stillness of the castle. She learned that his courtiers were not unkind, merely distant. They were beings who had lived so long that the frantic emotions of mortals were like a foreign language they had long since forgotten. They regarded her with a mild, placid curiosity, but they left her to their king. She was his project, his strange, living artifact. One evening, he brought her to the castle's lowest levels, to a crypt far beneath the foundations. Her heart hammered with a primal fear. Was this where he would finally reveal the monster? But the chamber he led her to was not a place of horror. It was a cavern of memories. The walls were lined with niches, and in each niche sat a single object, illuminated by a soft, phosphorescent moss that grew on the stone. A child's worn wooden horse. A single, pressed flower, its color miraculously preserved. A small, silver locket, tarnished with age. A shard of a clay pot. What is this place? Elara breathed, her fear forgotten, replaced by a profound sense of awe. Every 100 years, Cation said, his voice a near whisper in the hallowed silence, I allow myself to keep one object. One memory of a mortal I have known. His phrasing was delicate, but she understood. These were mementos of people he had cared for, people who had lived and died while he remained. It was a museum of his losses. He walked to one of the niches and gently picked up a small, intricately carved bone flute. "This belonged to a boy named Finn," he said, his gaze distant. "He was a shepherd in the hills that are now the Ashen Plains. He believed he could teach the birds new songs. He would sit for hours, playing for them. Caitian's thumb stroked the smooth bone. He died of a wolf's bite when he was 12. He had no children. He left nothing behind but a few simple melodies that I am now the only one in the world to remember." He put the flute to his lips. He did not play a song, but a series of clear, piercing notes, a fragment of a melody that was achingly sad and yet full of a wild, boyish hope. The sound echoed in the cavern, a ghost of a life long extinguished. Ilara felt tears prick her eyes. The sheer scale of his loneliness was staggering. To live so long, to watch everyone you ever knew turn to dust, to be the sole keeper of their memories, it was a burden she could barely comprehend. "You called my grief a creation," she said softly, when the last note had faded. "What is this, then? This collection of endings?" "It is my anchor," he replied, placing the flute carefully back in its niche. "It is how I remember that life, in all its fragility, is the most precious thing in the universe. Each of these objects holds more vitality for me than 1,000 years of my own existence." He turned to face her, his eyes dark with the weight of ages. "This is why I see it in you. Because I have spent millennia searching for it, hoarding it, protecting the memory of it. Your life, your breath, your heartbeat, your tears, your capacity for wonder and for pain, it shines like a beacon in this silent place." In that moment, standing in a tomb dedicated to lost lives, Ilara felt a profound shift within herself. Her sorrow for her own empty womb felt small, almost selfish, next to the vast, lonely grief of this man. And his words were not just a comfort anymore, they were a revelation. He did not value her in spite of her barrenness. He valued her because of the fierce, mortal life that her condition had forced her to confront. Her pain had made her sensitive to the beauty and tragedy of a falling leaf, a dying rose, a fleeting moment. Things an immortal, surrounded by permanence, craved to understand. She reached out, her movement slow, hesitant, and laid her hand on his arm. His skin was cool, smooth as marble, but it was not the cold of death. It was the cool of ancient stone, of deep, still water. He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of the muscle beneath her fingers, as if he were unused to being touched. But he did not pull away. "Thank you," she whispered. He looked down at her small, warm hand on the dark fabric of his sleeve. He did not ask what she was thanking him for. He simply nodded, a slow, solemn acknowledgement. They stood in silence for a long time, the mortal queen and the immortal king, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten lives. A fragile bridge of understanding was being built between them, not with words, but with shared silence, with a gesture of comfort, with the mutual recognition of the beautiful, terrible weight of being alive. The chill of the crypt was still there, but for the first time, Ilara did not feel it was coming from him. It was coming from the stone, from the earth, from the long, lonely passage of time itself. The arrival of the delegation from her homeland felt like an intrusion from a half-forgotten dream. 3 months had passed since she had come to Nocturne, 3 months in which her world had been quietly and completely remade. The sight of the familiar crimson and gold banners of House Valerus in the castle courtyard was a jarring shock. Leading them was Lord Gromley, her father's chief advisor, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in an expression of dour disapproval. With him was her cousin, Seraphina, a woman who had pitted Ilara with a cloying sweetness that always felt more like judgment. They had come, Gromley announced with a stiff bow, to inquire after their queen's well-being and to reaffirm the bonds of the treaty. Ilara knew the truth. They had come to see if the barren bride had broken yet. They were received in the throne room, a cavernous hall where Caitian's throne was carved from a single piece of obsidian, looking less like a seat of power and more like a frozen shard of night. Ilara stood beside it, as was her place. She wore a gown of deep violet, a color she had once despised for its association with mourning, but now found comforting in its quiet dignity. Lord Gromley's eyes scanned the hall, taking in the silent, watchful courtiers, the unnerving beauty of the king, and the profound lack of warmth. His gaze settled on Ilara, and a flicker of something, pity, or perhaps satisfaction, crossed his face. "Your Majesty," he said, addressing Caitian but looking at Ilara. "We trust our queen has been Comfortable, the word was laden with insinuation. The Queen's comfort is assured, Cation replied, his voice a low thrum of authority that made the very air vibrate. He did not elaborate. Seraphina stepped forward, her own gown a riot of sunny yellow that looked garish and loud in the subtle gloom of the hall. "Oh, Elara, cousin," she gushed, her voice painfully bright. "You are so pale. This northern air does not agree with you. But do not fret. We have brought you gifts. Tonics from the royal physician, to strengthen your constitution." She smiled a wide, meaningless smile. One must never give up hope, after all. The implication was clear, a cruel, public reminder of her perceived failing. A few years ago, the words would have pierced Elara like a shard of glass. She would have flushed with shame, lowered her eyes, and felt the familiar, hollow ache in her womb. But standing there, beside the silent, ancient king who had taught her to see life in a falling petal, the words felt pathetic. They were small, earthbound concerns from a world that no longer had a claim on her. She met her cousin's gaze, her own expression calm and unreadable. "Thank you, Seraphina. Your concern is, as it has always been." The subtle barb hit its mark, a flicker of irritation crossed Seraphina's face. Lord Gromley, sensing a loss of control, cleared his throat. "The king, my father, sends his greetings. He is eager for news. The treaty holds, but an alliance is strengthened by fruitfulness." By the promise of a future he was speaking in code, but his meaning was as blunt as a club. He was asking if she was pregnant. He was asking if the monster had managed to perform a miracle where a mortal prince had failed. The silence in the hall became heavy, suffocating. The eyes of the courtiers, usually so placid, held a new, sharper focus. They were watching their king. They were watching this clumsy, loud mortal demand an accounting of their queen's womb. Elara felt a flush of anger, hot and clean. How dare they? How dare they come into this place of quiet contemplation and try to drag her back into their narrow, suffocating world of bloodlines and breeding? Before she could speak, Cation moved. He did not rise from his throne, but he leaned forward slightly, a subtle shift of weight that seemed to draw all the light in the room toward him. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously soft. "The future of this kingdom," he said, his twilight eyes fixed on Lord Gromley, "is not measured in heartbeats. It is measured in epochs. Your king worries about the next generation. I am concerned with the next millennium." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "The queen's fruitfulness, as you so delicately put it, is a matter for myself and the queen alone. It is not a subject for diplomatic inquiry." Gromley paled, his blustering confidence deflating. "Of course, your majesty. No offense was intended." "And yet," Cation continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a silken threat, "offense was given. You come into my home. You insult my wife. You imply that her worth is something to be tallied like bushels of wheat at harvest." He rose from the throne then, a slow, deliberate unfolding of his tall frame. He seemed to fill the entire space, a being of immense, ancient power. "Lady Elara's value to this court is not in the children she may or may not bear. Her value is in her presence. She has brought a perspective to this place that it has not known in 5,000 years. She has reminded us of the beauty of fragility. She is not a vessel for a royal bloodline. She is the queen." He took Elara's hand, his cool fingers lacing through hers. The gesture was possessive, protective, and utterly unequivocal. It was a public declaration, not of a political alliance, but of a personal one. He was claiming her, not as a broodmare or a treaty bride, but as his. Seraphina stared, her mouth agape. Lord Gromley looked as if he might faint. They had expected to find a broken, weeping girl, a prisoner in a gilded cage. They had found a queen, standing beside a king who spoke of her not with pity, but with a fierce, proprietary reverence. "Your inquiries are concluded," Cation said, his voice returning to its normal, resonant calm, though the threat still lingered beneath it. "You will be given lodgings for the night. You will depart at dawn. We are finished here." It was a dismissal of absolute finality. The delegation, thoroughly routed, bowed and scraped their way out of the throne room, their bright colors seeming to fade as they retreated into the shadows. When they were gone, the hall returned to its customary silence. Cation did not release her hand. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Did I overstep?" he asked, the question a genuine inquiry. Ilara looked up at him, at the ancient, powerful being who had just defended her honor, who had articulated her worth in a way she was only just beginning to understand herself. She felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost brought her to her knees: gratitude, loyalty, and something else, something warm and terrifyingly new. "No," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "You did not overstep." He studied her face for a moment longer, then brought her hand to his lips. It was not the chaste, formal gesture of a courtier. He turned her hand over and pressed his cool lips to the tender skin of her wrist, directly over her pulse. She could feel the faint, hypnotic pull of his power, the ancient hunger that was an intrinsic part of his being. But it was gentle, controlled. It was a kiss that acknowledged her life, her warm, flowing blood, not as sustenance, but as the very thing he had just defended. It was the most intimate gesture she had ever known. "Good," he said softly, releasing her hand. "Because they are not welcome back." After the delegation had scurried away at first light, a profound quiet settled over the castle once more, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the silence of emptiness, but the charged silence of unspoken understanding. Cation's public defense of her had been a tectonic shift. It had redrawn the map of their relationship, transforming it from a political arrangement into something deeply personal. She was no longer just a guest, a ward, or a curiosity. She was his queen, and he had made that clear to both her world and his. The change was reflected in the court. The other immortals now inclined their heads to her with a new respect. They were still distant, still lost in their own ancient reveries, but their acknowledgement of her was no longer tinged with mere curiosity. It held a measure of acceptance. She belonged here now. That evening, she found him on the high battlements of the Eastern Tower, a place she had never dared to venture. The wind was a living thing up here, whipping her cloak around her and stealing the breath from her lungs. Below, the kingdom of Nocturne was a sea of shadows and faint, blue witchlight. Cation stood at the edge, looking not down at his lands, but up at the sky, where a sliver of a new moon hung like a scythe. She came to stand beside him, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The wind was their only conversation. "They will report back to my father that you have bewitched me," she said finally, her voice nearly snatched away by the gale. "Is that what I have done?" he asked, not turning to look at her. "You have shown me a different way to see," she answered carefully. "I spent my life believing I was a locked room with no key. You have told me the room was never locked at all." He was silent for a moment. The mortal mind is a beautiful, tragic thing. So desperate to build cages for itself. Cages of duty, of legacy, of purpose. You build your prisons and then you mourn the fact that you cannot fly. "And you," she countered, feeling a new boldness. "Do you have no cages, Your Majesty?" He turned his head then, his silver hair catching the faint moonlight, his twilight eyes seeming to hold the entire, vast emptiness of the night sky. "My cage is time, Ilara. It is a prison with no walls and no hope of escape. I am a statue in a river. The water of life flows past me, wearing me down particle by particle, but I remain. I watch the mountains crumble and the seas change their shape. Everyone I have ever cared for is a brief, beautiful flicker of light that I am doomed to outlast. My legacy is to be the sole witness to a world that is constantly erasing itself." His vulnerability was a raw, open thing, more shocking than any display of power. He was the king of quiet sorrows, and she was finally beginning to understand the depths of that sorrow. He was not deathless, he was life-sentenced. "The crypt," she said softly. "Your anchors." "My anchors," he affirmed with a slight nod. "Fragments of the river I try to hold on to. But they are just fragments. I remember the song, but I have forgotten the boy's laugh. I remember the painting, but I have forgotten the warmth of the artist's hand. The memories remain, but the life within them fades. That is my curse. To be a library of stories whose emotional truth is slowly turning to dust." She understood then what he meant when he said she had brought a new perspective. She was not a memory. She was here, now. Her heart was beating, her breath was misting in the cold air, her sorrow and her dawning hope were vibrant, present tense things. For him, she was not another story to be archived. She was the story as it was being written. "Teach me," she said, the words an impulsive plea. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. "Teach me to see the way you do," she clarified, her voice gaining strength. "Teach me to see the life in things. Not just in falling leaves and paintings, but in this." She gestured out at the dark, silent kingdom. "In the stillness. In the shadows. You have lived 10,000 years. You must see a world I cannot even imagine. Show me." His expression softened. The ancient sadness in his eyes was tempered by a flicker of something she could not name. It was not pity. It was not affection. It was a kind of recognition, as if he were seeing a fellow prisoner who had just discovered a new way to look out the window. "Very well," he said. He held out his hand. "But it is a difficult lesson. It requires you to let go of everything you think you know about life and death, beginning and end." She placed her hand in his. His grasp was cool and firm. "I have nothing left to lose." His lips curved into that slow, gentle smile. "That is where you are wrong. You have everything. You simply haven't learned how to value it yet." He led her from the battlements, their clasped hands a small point of connection against the vast, cold indifference of the night. He was not just her king, not just her protector. He was becoming her tutor, her guide into a world of deeper, quieter meaning. He was going to teach her the language of his long, lonely existence, and she, in turn, was teaching him to remember the feeling behind the words. The barren queen and the immortal king, two solitudes, beginning to find a shared landscape in the heart of the long, endless night. His lessons were not of words, but of experience. He began to unravel the world for her, showing her the intricate, hidden life that pulsed beneath the silent surface of his kingdom. He took her to the crystal caves deep beneath the castle, where millennia of slow, patient dripping had formed vast, cathedral-like structures of quartz. The air hummed with a low, resonant frequency. "Listen," he murmured, his voice barely disturbing the silence. She closed her eyes and strained her ears. At first, she heard nothing but the blood rushing in her own head. But then, as she quieted her own frantic, mortal rhythms, she began to perceive it, a deep, slow thrum, like the planet itself breathing in its sleep. "The stone is growing," Cation explained. "An inch every century. It is a life so slow you cannot see it, but you can feel it. It has its own consciousness, its own purpose. It is dreaming of the mountain it will one day become." She stood in the heart of the humming crystal, feeling the immense, patient life of the rock around her, and her own brief, 70-year span felt like the frantic flutter of a hummingbird's wings. It was not insignificant, but it was part of a much grander, slower song. Another night, he led her to an abandoned aviary at the top of a disused spire. It had been built for a long-dead mortal consort who had missed the birds of her homeland. Now it was empty, home only to dust and silence. Cation opened the shutters to the night sky, and they sat on a stone bench, looking out. "Now, we wait," he said. They sat for hours in perfect silence. The moon climbed the sky, bathing the world in its sterile, silver light. Ilara grew restless, her mind churning. What were they waiting for? What was the point of this? But she remembered his lesson in the cave and forced herself to be still, to simply exist in the moment. Just before the false dawn, it happened. A flock of shadow moths, creatures as large as her hand with wings the color of crushed velvet, were drawn to the faint light of the rising moon. They fluttered into the aviary, their movements silent and graceful, their wings creating gentle currents in the air. They danced in the moonlight for a few precious minutes, a silent, swirling ballet of darkness and light, before disappearing back into the night as the first hint of gray appeared on the horizon. Ilara was breathless. It was the most beautiful, ephemeral thing she had ever seen. "They live for a single night," Cation said softly, after they were gone. "They hatch in the dusk, they dance, and they are gone by sunrise. Their entire existence is for this one, beautiful, silent flight." He looked at her. "Is their life meaningless because it is short?" "No," she whispered, the answer a certainty in her heart. It's beautiful because it's short. He nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. You are beginning to understand. Through these lessons, the castle transformed around her. The silent corridors were no longer empty, but full of the patient life of the stone. The shadows were not an absence of light, but a canvas for the brief, beautiful dance of moths. The silence was not a void, but a space in which one could hear the planet breathing. Her own transformation was just as profound. The aching hollow within her began to fill, not with a child, but with a new awareness. She started a journal, not to record events, but to capture the fleeting moments of beauty she was learning to see, the way the witchlight reflected in a puddle of rainwater, the intricate geometry of a spider's web, the scent of the night-blooming jasmine after a storm. She was not creating a legacy of blood, but a legacy of observation, a testament to her own, unique experience of the world. One afternoon, he found her in the conservatory, not weeping, but sketching the delicate, veined petals of a moon orchid in her journal. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice him until he stood before her. You have found a new language, he observed, looking at the drawing. You gave me the alphabet, she replied, not looking up from her work. A comfortable ease had grown between them, replacing the fear and formality of her first months. He sat on the bench beside her, a companionable silence falling between them as she finished the drawing. He watched her hands, the way she moved the charcoal with a focused, reverent grace. I have a request to make of you, Ilara, he said after a while, his tone serious. She finally looked up, her curiosity piqued. What is it? In my 10,000 years, this castle has always been a place of preservation. A museum of what was. It is a monument to endings. He looked around the somber, beautiful garden of night flowers. You are a creature of beginnings. I would like you to create something here. Something that is yours. She stared at him, uncomprehending. Create what? Whatever you wish, he said with a small shrug. A garden. A gallery. A workshop. Some part of this castle that is not about memory, but about the present. A place of life, as you define it now. The offer was immense. He was giving her a piece of his eternal, unchanging kingdom and telling her to make it mortal, to make it hers. He was entrusting her with the one thing his world lacked, the beauty of the temporary. An idea, wild and audacious, sparked in her mind. There is a courtyard on the southern face of the castle, she said slowly, her heart beginning to beat faster. It is sheltered from the wind. The stone is lighter there. I have seen the sun touch its walls for an hour or two in the afternoon. Cation nodded, his eyes intent on hers. I know the one. I want to make a sun garden, she declared, the words feeling momentous. A place for flowers like the ones from my home. Roses, and lavender, and peonies. Things that are bright, and fragrant, and that will die at the first frost. Something impossibly alive, right in the heart of your castle. It was a challenge, a direct contradiction to everything Nocturne stood for. It was an importation of her world into his, a celebration of the very fragility and fleetingness he had spent millennia watching from a distance. For a long moment, Cation simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. She wondered if she had gone too far, if she had mistaken his intellectual curiosity for a true desire for change. Then, he smiled. It was not his usual slow, gentle smile. This one was wider, brighter, and it reached his eyes, making them shine with a light she had never seen before. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated delight. A garden of defiant, temporary life, he said, the words full of wonder. Yes. I think that is a perfect beginning. He was not just her king, her protector, her teacher. He was her partner. He was giving her the soil, and he was trusting her to plant the seeds. The barren queen was finally going to make something grow.